NASA has spent decades planning missions to the moon. But building a real city there is a completely different problem. Today, we're breaking down why returning to the moon is possible, but staying there may never be. This is the hard line between exploration and true settlement. A story about limits of technology, of biology, and of human systems. Now let's begin. Here is a number that should stop you cold. Since the Apollo program first sent human beings to the moon in 1969, the world has poured more than $500 billion into space exploration programs. $500 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is not a budget line buried in a congressional footnote. That is the accumulated financial commitment of the most technologically advanced civilization in the history of this planet, directed decade after decade toward one singular ambition, reaching beyond the boundary of Earth. And yet, after all of that money, after all of those launches, all of those engineers pulling all-nighters in mission control, all of those speeches about the destiny of our species, not a single child has ever been born outside of Earth. Not one. In over 50 years of spaceflight, not a single human pregnancy has been carried to term anywhere other than the planet where our species first appeared. The moon, sitting roughly 239,000 miles from your front door, has never hosted a birthday. Mars, where we have driven robots across ancient riverbeds and analyzed the chemistry of alien dust, has never heard a human heartbeat in person. Let that contrast sink in for a moment, because it is more than a curiosity. It is the central paradox of the space age. We have sent wheeled robots to roll across the surface of another planet. We have landed a helicopter on Mars and watched it fly in an atmosphere so thin that engineers back on Earth were not sure it was physically possible. We have parked telescopes in deep space that can photograph galaxies formed just a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. We are, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily capable civilization when it comes to reaching into the void. But we cannot cook an independent meal on the moon. Think about that with the full weight it deserves. The moon is not Mars. The moon is not some distant target requiring months of transit through interplanetary space. At the speed of the Apollo spacecraft, the moon is approximately 3 days away. 3 days. That is shorter than many road trips across the American continent. And yet, if you placed a group of humans on the lunar surface tomorrow and cut the supply line from Earth, they would be dead within days, not because of any single catastrophic failure, but because absolutely nothing about their survival would be self-generated. Every molecule of oxygen, every calorie of food, every drop of drinkable water would have had to come from somewhere else. The moon, our nearest neighbor in space, would be an execution chamber the moment the resupply missions stopped. This is the paradox that never quite makes it into the press releases. We celebrate what we can reach. We rarely interrogate whether reaching something is the same as being able to live there. Imagine a team of engineers who spend decades designing and constructing a bridge across an ocean. An extraordinary feat. An achievement that rewrites the limits of what humanity is capable of. And then, on the day the bridge opens, everyone drives to the other side, stands at the edge, stares at the ground and realizes this ground is not soil. It cannot support a foundation. It cannot grow food. It cannot hold water. The bridge was real, but the dream of building a home on the other side, that was always a different project entirely, one that the bridge builders never actually solved. That is precisely where we are with space exploration. The rockets are the bridge, and for 50 years, we have been confusing the bridge with the destination. The difference between visiting a place and living in a place is not measured in kilometers. It is not even measured in years. It is measured in civilizational depth in the accumulated systems, institutions, supply chains, biological adaptations, legal frameworks, and cultural roots that make permanent human presence not just survivable, but sustainable across generations. By that measure, the distance between Earth and the moon is not 239,000 miles. It is the entire span of human civilization, and we have barely begun to cross it. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in the conversation about humanity's future in space. Because when we blur the line between visiting and living, when we let ourselves treat a crude lunar outpost as evidence that we have settled the moon, we make strategic errors that cascade across decades of policy funding and scientific priority. We celebrate the wrong victories. We ask the wrong questions. We measure progress by the wrong metrics. So let us ask the right question right now, before we go any further. If you were given the choice to live on the moon for 10 years, with every physical need met by supply shipments from Earth, with breathable air and food and water and shelter all provided for you, would you say yes, and consider carefully why? Does your answer to that question reveal exactly the core problem at the heart of the challenge of settling space? Take a moment with that. Most people, when they honestly examine their reaction, find something interesting. The hesitation is not about comfort. It is not really about danger in the conventional sense. It points to something deeper, something about what it means to truly inhabit a place, rather than simply occupy it. But before you finalize your answer, there is something you should know. Even that question contains a hidden trap, a trick of framing that NASA itself has been falling into for 50 years. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Words do not just describe reality. Sometimes they construct it. And in the world of space policy, there is one word that has done more damage to clear thinking than any budget cut or failed rocket engine: the word permanent. Open almost any official document from a national space agency, any 10-year roadmap, any presidential directive on lunar exploration, any bilateral agreement between spacefaring nations, and you will find it. Permanent human presence on the moon, permanent lunar outpost, establishing a permanent foothold beyond Earth. The word appears so frequently in so many official contexts that it has acquired the texture of a technical term. It sounds precise. It sounds like something that means what it says. It does not mean what you think it means. In the ordinary sense, the sense any reader of the English language brings to that word permanent implies continuity without planned interruption. It implies that people will live somewhere indefinitely, that the occupation is open-ended, that the settlement is not scheduled to end. When a city is permanently established, it means the city keeps going. When a family permanently relocates, it means they do not intend to leave. In space policy, permanent means something dramatically narrower. It means continuously occupied by at least some rotating crew members as long as funding and political will hold. That is not permanence in any meaningful sense. That is a very expensive hotel with an aggressive checkout policy. The International Space Station has been continuously occupied since the year 2000, but no one who has lived there has stayed permanently. Astronauts rotate in and out on missions of roughly 6 months. The station itself depends entirely on a constant, unbroken chain of resupply missions from Earth. Remove the resupply chain, and the permanent presence becomes a body count within weeks. When a corporation announces a permanent overseas office, what it often means in practice is a serviced office suite in a shared building staffed by employees on 1-year rotational assignments who are eager to return home the moment their contract ends. Nobody confuses this with actually moving the company's operations permanently to another country. But in space policy, we make exactly this confusion routinely and with official endorsement. The gap between what permanent means to the public and what it means to mission planners is not a minor semantic quibble. It is a civilizational category error. And to understand why, you need to think about what genuine settlement actually looks like and recognize that there are not 2 categories here, but 4 each, separated from the next, not by a step, but by a canyon. The first level is a visit. A crew travels to a location, completes specific objectives, and returns. The moon has been visited. Apollo is the definitive example. Visits are extraordinary achievements in engineering and human courage. They prove you can get there. They prove nothing about whether you can stay. The second level is a base. A base is a facility where a rotating crew can conduct sustained operations over months or years, but the crew rotates the base depends entirely on external supply, and no one is expected to make it their permanent home. The International Space Station is humanity's best current example of a base. A lunar base of this type is what most current Artemis planning documents actually describe, regardless of the word permanent that appears in their executive summaries. The third level is a permanent station. This is a facility where at least some personnel are intended to remain indefinitely, where second-generation infrastructure begins to develop, and where the dependency on external supply begins to be reduced, though never eliminated, through local resource extraction. No such station exists anywhere beyond Earth. Antarctica's research stations come close as an Earthbound analogy, but even those are staffed exclusively by people who consider themselves temporary residents. The fourth level is a city. A city is a self-sustaining human community capable of reproducing itself across generations without external intervention. It has economic logic independent of any parent civilization. It has governance structures developed organically by its own population. Its children grow up considering it home, not a posting. No city of this type exists anywhere beyond Earth, and the gap between a rotating 4-person lunar base and a lunar city is not a matter of scale. It is a matter of civilization. Here is where the damage happens. The media, and to be fair, many space agency communicators who should know better regularly, collapse these 4 categories into a single narrative arc, as though moving from level 1 to level 4 was simply a matter of building more hardware and launching more missions. A photograph of a lunar landing becomes a symbol of humanity's destiny as a multiplanetary species. A plan for a rotating crew base becomes the first step toward a moon city. The press release says permanent outpost, and the headline reads Lunar Colony. This is not entirely dishonest. The connection between the levels is real. You cannot build a city without first building a base, but the distance between them is being systematically underrepresented, and that underrepresentation has consequences. It allows politicians to claim credit for civilizational ambitions while funding only engineering milestones. It allows the public to feel that the project is further along than it is, and it prevents the hard questions, the truly hard questions about economics, biology, governance, and law from ever receiving the sustained attention they require. To put it plainly, calling a 4-person rotating lunar outpost a city is roughly equivalent to calling a camping tent pitched in Barrow, Alaska, where the average January temperature hovers around 23 degrees below zero, Fahrenheit, and the sun does not rise for months, a beachfront resort. Technically, a tent is a structure. Technically, Barrow is in America. Everything else about that description is a fantasy. The tent keeps you alive through the night. That is not a resort. And a pressurized habitat keeping 4 rotating astronauts alive for 6 months is not a city, no matter how many times the word permanent appears in the accompanying policy document. Now, if a nation were to deploy a fully autonomous robot on the lunar surface, one capable of operating continuously without crew, maintaining a persistent mechanical presence for years on end, would that qualify as settlement? Does a machine count as a human footprint? Does continuous operation constitute a claim? These are not trick questions. They are the exact questions that governments and legal scholars are genuinely debating right now in real policy rooms with real implications for how the next century of space activity will be governed. And the answer to that question leads directly into a geopolitical race that is already underway, one in which the winner will not necessarily be the nation that arrives first. Do not let anyone tell you the new space race is just a spectacle. What is happening right now between the United States and China in the domain of lunar exploration is not a replay of Apollo-era nationalism dressed up in 21st century branding. It is something more consequential, more structurally significant, and if you understand what is actually at stake, far more interesting than a simple competition over who plants a flag first. Both nations are building real hardware, not concept art. Not PowerPoint slides presented at aerospace conferences to generate enthusiasm and budget approvals. Real rockets, real landers, real orbital platforms, real timelines with real funding attached to them. The United States, through the Artemis program, has already returned American astronauts to lunar orbit and is working toward crewed landings. The Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket America has built since Saturn V has flown. Agreements with commercial partners like SpaceX and Blue Origin are generating actual vehicles, not just promises. On the other side of the ledger, China has landed robotic spacecraft on the far side of the moon, something no other nation has accomplished. Its Chang'e program has retrieved lunar samples and returned them to Earth. Its roadmap toward a crewed lunar landing and eventually a joint lunar research station with Russia is documented, funded, and proceeding on schedule. This is not theatre. Both nations are genuinely committed to showing up, but here is where the conventional framing of this competition fails almost completely. The goal of this race is not the moon, not in any meaningful settlement sense. Nobody in any serious policy position in Washington or Beijing believes that the primary strategic objective of their lunar program is to establish a city on the moon within the next 50 years. That is not what either side is optimizing for, and once you understand what they are actually optimizing for, the entire competition looks different. What both nations are racing toward is the right to write the rules. Think about what it meant in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Portugal and Spain competed to place their ships along the great maritime trade routes of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The goal was not to colonize every island they encountered. The goal was not even primarily to extract resources from the territories they claimed. The deeper strategic objective was to establish presence, physical, documented, legally recognized presence, at the choke points and corridors through which all future trade and movement would flow. The nation that controlled the route controlled the commerce. The nation that controlled the commerce controlled the century. What Spain and Portugal understood intuitively and then explicitly was that geographic position is power, not because of what exists at a given location, but because of what must pass through it. The Moon occupies precisely this kind of position in the geography of the inner solar system. The Moon is not compelling, primarily because of what sits on its surface, though there are genuinely valuable resources there, which we will examine in detail. The Moon is compelling because of where it sits in space. Cislunar space, the volume of orbital territory between Earth and the Moon, is the gravitational gateway to everything beyond. Any mission to Mars, to the asteroid belt, to the outer planets, to any destination in the deep solar system must transit through cislunar space. And the nation or coalition of nations that establishes operational dominance in cislunar space through infrastructure, through legal precedent, through the sheer momentum of established presence, holds a structural advantage over every other actor that follows. Who controls lunar orbit controls the highway to Mars and beyond. This is why the real drivers behind both the American and Chinese lunar programs are not at their core about settlement at all. They are about four things that have nothing to do with human habitation, prestige, technical standards, cislunar resource access, and legal precedent. Prestige, because in the international order, the capacity to operate in space at a high level is a signal of comprehensive national capability, scientific, industrial, organizational, and military. The nation that leads in space is understood by allies and rivals alike to be a nation that leads, period. Technical standards because the infrastructure of cislunar space, the communication protocols, the docking interfaces, the orbital traffic management systems, the safety standards for lunar surface operations will be written by whoever builds. The first generation of that infrastructure, the nation that builds first gets to define the terms. Every subsequent actor must either adopt those terms or build incompatible systems at enormous cost. Cislunar resource access, because the polar regions of the Moon contain water ice in quantities that, if confirmed and extractable, would transform the economics of deep space travel. Water is not just water in space. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen rocket propellant. A lunar propellant depot would reduce the cost of missions to Mars and beyond by orders of magnitude. Whoever controls access to that resource controls the fuel economy of the solar system. And legal precedent, because the rules governing lunar operations, who can extract resources, who can establish exclusion zones around facilities, who has standing to resolve disputes, are being written right now in the gap between existing international space law and operational reality. The Artemis Accords, which over 40 nations have signed, represent the American vision for how those rules should work. China and Russia, conspicuously absent from those accords, are developing their own frameworks. Whichever set of norms becomes the operational standard will shape space governance for generations. None of this is about living on the Moon. All of it is about controlling what the Moon makes possible. If the race to the Moon is actually a race about technical standards and space law, then who is the real winner? The nation that gets there first, or the nation that stays the longest? The answer matters enormously, because arriving first is an engineering problem. Staying longest is a civilizational one. But whoever wins that political race, whichever flag flies longest over the southern polar region, whichever nation's docking standard becomes the default, they will all face the same enemy. An enemy with no nationality, no budget, and no interest in negotiating. The Moon itself. Most people, when they think about the dangers of the Moon, imagine something like the dangers of an extreme environment on Earth. A desert, perhaps. An Arctic plateau. The summit of a very tall mountain. Hostile, certainly. Deadly if you are unprepared. But fundamentally passive, an environment that does not care about you one way or the other, that will kill you through indifference rather than through any active mechanism. This framing is dangerously wrong. The moon does not simply expose you to conditions your body cannot handle. The moon operates through a set of mechanisms that are active, cumulative, and in several cases irreversible mechanisms that do not announce themselves with immediate catastrophic failure, but instead work steadily, invisibly, and over time, dismantling your biology with a patience that no human engineering project has yet found a reliable answer to. Start with radiation. The moon has no magnetic field worthy of the name and no atmosphere to speak of. Earth's magnetic field acts as an enormous invisible shield, deflecting the vast majority of charged particles streaming from the sun and from deep cosmic sources. Earth's atmosphere adds another layer of protection, absorbing and scattering the remainder. On the lunar surface, both of those shields are absent. You are exposed without buffer to the full spectrum of solar radiation and galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles that have traveled from exploded stars across thousands of light years to arrive unremarkably in your body. The key thing to understand about radiation exposure on the moon is that it does not feel like anything. You cannot sense it. It produces no immediate pain, no obvious symptom, no alarm that something is wrong. What it does produce constantly and silently is damage at the molecular level, breaks in DNA strands, corrupted cellular repair mechanisms, the slow accumulation of mutations that the body's own maintenance systems struggle to keep pace with. Think of it like this: a smoker does not feel their lungs deteriorating from the first cigarette. The damage is real, measurable, progressive compounding, but it operates on a timeline that allows the person experiencing it to minimize its significance on any given day. Radiation exposure on the moon works the same way. It is not going to kill you this afternoon. It is going to spend years quietly editing your DNA, elevating your cancer risk, degrading your immune function, and taxing your cellular repair capacity until the cumulative account comes due in a way that cannot be ignored. Now add lunar dust. Lunar regolith, the layer of fragmented material covering the moon's surface, is not dirt. It is not sand. It is not anything that any analogy drawn from Earth's surface environments will accurately capture. The particles that make up lunar dust have been formed over approximately 4 billion years of unceasing meteorite bombardment in an environment with no wind and no liquid water. On Earth, geological and erosive processes gradually round off the sharp edges of fragmented rock particles. Wind carries particles against each other, wearing them smooth. Water tumbles them, polishing their surfaces into the relatively gentle shapes of beach sand or river gravel. None of that has ever happened on the moon. Every particle of lunar dust is exactly as sharp as the moment it was created by impact or thermal fracturing. The individual grains are jagged, angular, and electrostatically charged, which means they cling to everything they touch, penetrate every gap they can find, and do not easily release once they have adhered to a surface. Breathing lunar dust, even in small quantities, is not like breathing ordinary dust. It is closer to inhaling powdered, broken glass. Each particle is a microscopic blade, irregular in shape with edges capable of lacerating the delicate tissues of the respiratory system, at a scale too small to feel in the moment, but impossible to reverse once the damage accumulates. There is no known antidote. There is no medical treatment that removes silicate particles from lung tissue once they have embedded themselves. The Apollo astronauts who tracked lunar dust into their capsules after moonwalks reported that it smelled like burnt gunpowder and irritated their eyes and airways almost immediately, and those exposures were measured in hours, not years. Imagine living with that problem for a decade. And then there is gravity, or rather the absence of enough of it. The moon's gravitational pull is approximately 1/6 of Earth's. This is often presented as a charming feature. You could jump 6 times as high, lift 6 times as much weight, move with a lightness that no earthbound human ever experiences. What is not charming is what happens to a human body that lives in 1/6 gravity for years rather than days. The human skeleton is not a passive structure. It is a living tissue that responds constantly to mechanical loading, the stress placed on bones by movement, weight-bearing, and the ordinary demands of existing in a gravitational field calibrated to Earth's surface. When that loading is reduced to 1/6 its normal level, the skeleton receives a signal that it is carrying more structural capacity than it needs, and it begins systematically and progressively to reduce that excess capacity. Bone density decreases. The architectural microstructure of bone degrades. The process is not dramatic, it does not announce itself, but it is relentless. Astronauts who spend 6 months on the International Space Station in zero gravity return to Earth with measurably reduced bone density and require months of rehabilitation to restore normal function. 1/6 gravity is better than zero, but it is not good. Over years, the damage compounds in ways that current countermeasures, exercise regimens, dietary supplements can slow but not stop. So to summarize the basic situation, you are living in an environment where invisible radiation is gradually corrupting your DNA, where microscopic glass shards are accumulating in your lungs, and where the gravitational field is slowly instructing your skeleton to dissolve itself. The moon at its core is a room where everything is trying to kill you. Radiation working from above, dust working from below, and gravity quietly liquefying your bones from the inside. None of these mechanisms care about your mission timeline. None of them can be negotiated with. None of them are problems that better public relations or a more optimistic policy document will resolve. If researchers were to confirm that 10 years of lunar residence would alter the human body so fundamentally through bone loss, radiation damage, and physiological adaptation to reduced gravity, that returning to Earth's gravitational environment would become medically impossible, would that change the definition of permanent settlement? If you cannot go home, are you a settler or something else entirely? That question is no longer hypothetical. And what the science is beginning to point toward is something even more unsettling than the question itself. The previous section described what the moon does to an adult body that arrives already fully formed a skeleton, built over decades of one gravitational unit. A cardiovascular system calibrated to pump blood against Earth's pull A. Vestibular system wired to interpret spatial orientation in a field that the moon cannot replicate. The damage is real, cumulative, and in several dimensions irreversible. But at least the adult who travels to the moon began with a complete biological blueprint, assembled under the conditions it was designed for. Now consider a different scenario entirely. Consider a child who never had that blueprint assembled on Earth at all. Not one single scientific experiment in the history of human spaceflight has tested what happens to a pregnancy in 1/6 gravity. Not one study has tracked the skeletal development of an infant through its critical growth windows in a reduced gravitational field. Not one researcher has observed how a human brain, which in its earliest years is organizing itself at extraordinary speed, aids building the neural architectures that will govern movement, balance, spatial reasoning, and 1,000 other functions, constructs itself when the gravitational input that evolution assumed would be present is reduced to 1/6 of its expected value. The data does not exist. The experiments have not been run. The question has not been answered because no one anywhere has yet been in a position to answer it. This is not a minor gap in the literature. This is the central unanswered biological question of any serious lunar settlement project, and it has received a fraction of the attention devoted to rocket engine efficiency or habitat pressure systems. To understand why it matters so profoundly, you need to step back and think about what the human body actually is at a deep evolutionary level. The architecture of the human skeleton, its density, its geometric structure, the way bone mass is distributed across load-bearing joints, was not designed by engineers. It was shaped by approximately 4 million years of our ancestors, living, moving, hunting, climbing, and surviving in a gravitational field of exactly one gravitational unit. Every bone in your body is in a very real sense a solution to the specific mechanical problem of existing in Earth's gravity. The curvature of your spine, the density of your femur, the architecture of the small bones in your foot, all of it reflects an extraordinarily long optimization process, conducted by natural selection in a one gravitational unit, environment. The human cardiovascular system tells the same story. Your heart pumps blood upward against gravity to reach your brain, and downward to circulate through your lower limbs in a pattern of pressure and flow calibrated to Earth's pull. Your blood vessel walls are structured, and your autonomic nervous system is tuned to manage the fluid dynamics of a body standing upright in one gravitational unit. The vestibular system, the intricate apparatus in your inner ear, that tells your brain which direction is down, how fast you are moving, whether you are tilting or accelerating, is a 4 million-year-old instrument, precision-built for one environment. Place an adult in 1/6 gravity, and all of these systems begin to drift from their calibrated state. The drift is gradual and in some respects reversible in the short term, but the adult at least started from the correct baseline. Now place a developing fetus in 1/6 gravity, then raise the infant in 1/6 gravity. Let the child's skeleton consolidate through its critical developmental windows in 1/6 gravity. Allow the cardiovascular system to establish its baseline operating parameters in 1/6 gravity. Let the vestibular system wire itself into the brain's spatial processing networks in an environment where 1/6 gravity is not an aberration, but the only reality the child has ever known. What emerges from that developmental process is not a human body that has adapted to the moon. It is a human body that was built for the moon, constructed according to a different set of specifications than any human body that has ever existed before. The skeleton would likely be longer, lighter, less dense, optimized for a gravitational load that is 1/6 what Earth demands. The cardiovascular system might develop with different baseline pressures, different vessel architecture, different autonomic tuning. The vestibular system would be calibrated to a gravitational reference that has no analog in any environment on Earth. And here is where the scenario moves from medically concerning to something closer to philosophically staggering. A child built by 1/6 gravity, raised entirely in 1/6 gravity, might find that returning to Earth to the one gravitational unit environment in which every other human being in history has lived is not an inconvenience or a challenge requiring physical rehabilitation. It might be lethally incompatible. The cardiovascular system that functions perfectly on the moon might be structurally incapable of sustaining circulation against Earth's pull. The skeleton that developed optimally for lunar loads might fracture under the mechanical demands of simply standing on Earth's surface. The vestibular system that learned to orient itself in 1/6 gravity might generate cascading neurological dysfunction when confronted with one gravitational unit. This is not science fiction. This is the straightforward extrapolation of principles that exercise physiologists and aerospace medicine researchers already understand and document in adult astronauts, applied to the far more consequential case of a developing human organism whose entire biological architecture is being assembled from scratch in the wrong gravitational field. What this means in plain terms is that the first child born and raised on the moon might represent something that has no precedent in the entire 4 million-year history of the human species. A human being for whom Earth is not a home they left but a planet they cannot visit. A person who is in the most literal biological sense not adapted to the world from which their parents came. This forces a question that goes well beyond medicine or engineering or mission planning. That child whose DNA is entirely human, whose parents were born on Earth, whose language and culture and memory are continuous with human civilization, is that child a person of Earth? What species do they belong to? What civilization claims for them? And what civilization can they claim in return? These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are genuine questions about the nature of human identity at a moment when the physical conditions of existence have diverged so fundamentally from the baseline that produced our species, and they connect directly to the settlement question in a way that is impossible to avoid. A city, a real city, not a rotating crew base with a flattering name, requires a next generation. It requires children who grow up in it, who consider it home, who build their lives there, who have children of their own. There is no such thing as a self-sustaining civilization composed entirely of adults who arrived from somewhere else and intend to be replaced by other adults from somewhere else. A city without native-born residents is not a city. It is a deployment. But if the next generation on the moon is biologically shaped by 1/6 gravity in the ways that the science suggests, if those children cannot return to Earth, if they are adapted to a world their parents only partially understood, then we are not talking about building a lunar city in any conventional sense. We are talking about the deliberate creation of a divergent human lineage. An accelerated evolutionary branch, driven not by millions of years of gradual selection, but by the abrupt imposition of a radically different physical environment on developing human organisms. Whether that is an act of civilization building or something more troubling depends entirely on who you ask and what ethical framework you bring to the question. If the children of moon settlers are biologically unable to live on Earth, if they are in the most concrete physiological sense of people of the moon and not of the world their parents came from, are we building a new civilization? Or are we abandoning our own children to a world they never chose? But even if we resolved every dimension of the biological challenge, even if medicine and engineering and decades of research delivered complete answers to every question raised in this act, there would still remain a wall taller than any of them, a wall more invisible, and one that no rocket has ever been built to break through. We established that the moon is trying to kill you through radiation, dust, and gravity, and that even the children born there might be biologically severed from the planet their parents called home. These are formidable obstacles. They are the kind of obstacles that sound to a certain type of optimistic mind, like engineering problems, waiting for sufficiently motivated engineers and sufficiently large budgets to solve them. So let us talk about the budget. Not in the soft, impressionistic way that space advocacy documents typically discuss funding, with phrases like significant investment and sustained commitment floated in paragraphs that never quite arrive at specific numbers. Let us talk about what it would actually cost in concrete terms to build something on the moon that deserves the word city rather than the word outpost. The first number you need to understand is the cost of moving mass from Earth's surface to the lunar surface. This is the foundational economic constraint from which everything else derives. Under the best current estimates, using the most cost-efficient launch systems available today, delivering 1 kilogram of payload to the moon costs somewhere in the range of what you would pay for a well-appointed luxury automobile. Call it between $30,000 and $50,000 per kilogram, depending on the mission architecture. SpaceX's continued development of Starship is designed to reduce this dramatically, and we will return to that in a moment. But even with aggressive cost reduction, the physics of the problem do not disappear. Getting mass off Earth and onto the moon requires energy, and energy at the scales required for genuine settlement costs money that accumulates with brutal speed. Now apply that number to something concrete. A 10-story building on Earth, a modest, mid-rise, nothing architecturally ambitious, the kind of structure you would find in any medium-sized American city, contains somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 metric tons of material depending on its construction method. Steel, concrete, glass, wiring, plumbing, interior systems. If you attempted to construct even the most stripped-down version of such a structure on the moon using materials shipped from Earth, the transportation cost alone before a single bolt is tightened, before a single room is finished, before a single person moves in, would run into the hundreds of billions of US dollars. For one building, the gross domestic product of states like Wyoming or Vermont, the smaller economies in the American Union run somewhere around 40 to 50 billion US dollars annually. A single, modest lunar high-rise transport costs only would consume several years of their entire economic output. Scale that up to a city, even a small one, with the infrastructure, housing, water systems, power generation, medical facilities, food production, and waste management that any self-sustaining human community requires, and you arrive at a number that is not in the billions. It is in the trillions, multiple trillions, and that estimate covers only the cost of moving the raw materials. It does not include engineering, construction, labor, life support, integration, habitat design, or the decades of operational overhead required to keep the facility running before it reaches any level of self-sufficiency. This is where many people reflexively point to NASA and ask why the agency has not simply made this happen. The answer is not that NASA lacks ambition or intelligence or dedicated people. The answer is that NASA is not structurally designed for a project of this type, and demanding that it perform like one is a category error of the same kind we examined in Act 1 when discussing the language of settlement. NASA operates on annual appropriations from Congress. Its budget, currently somewhere around 25 billion US dollars per year, is renewed, renegotiated, and frequently redirected with each new administration. The agency has experienced program cancellations, mission scope reductions, and priority shifts tied directly to the 4-year rhythm of presidential elections. Constellation was cancelled. the asteroid redirect mission was cancelled. The specific architecture of Artemis has been modified multiple times as political winds shifted. This is not a criticism of NASA as an institution. It is a description of the structural reality within which NASA operates. A city requires a commitment measured in centuries, not election cycles. You cannot build civilization-scale infrastructure on a project timeline that resets every 4 years when a new administration reviews the previous president's space agenda. Asking NASA to build a lunar city using annual congressional appropriations is roughly equivalent to asking the Department of Defense to design, finance, construct, and operate a major commercial international airport. The Department of Defense employs brilliant engineers. It has a substantial budget. It has managed logistical operations of breathtaking complexity. But building and running civilian aviation infrastructure is not its function, and the institutional architecture that makes it effective at what it does would actively obstruct the different kind of effectiveness required for a different kind of project. NASA is a remarkable institution for what it is. What it is not is a century-scale infrastructure developer with guaranteed multi-generational funding and immunity from political cycles. Here is where the private sector enters the conversation, trailing considerable excitement behind it. SpaceX, in particular, has achieved something genuinely extraordinary, a reduction in launch costs by approximately a factor of 10 compared to previous generation systems accomplished primarily through the development of reusable, first-stage boosters. The Falcon 9 has transformed the economics of getting to low Earth orbit. Starship, if it reaches full operational capability and achieves the reusability and launch cadence its developers are targeting, could reduce the cost of reaching the moon significantly further. This is real progress. It should not be dismissed. But here is the paradox that the excitement tends to gloss over. Reducing the cost of lunar delivery by a factor of 10 means that shipping 1 kilogram to the moon might eventually cost $3,000 to $5,000 rather than $30,000 to $50,000. At that price, our 10-story building, which previously cost hundreds of billions in transport alone, now costs tens of billions in transport alone. That is a genuine improvement. It is also still an almost incomprehensible sum for a single structure in a settlement that would need thousands of structures to function as a city. 10 times cheaper than impossible is not the same thing as affordable. The mathematics of city building at lunar distances do not become tractable simply because the cost curve is moving in the right direction. They require a different economic model entirely, one that is not based on shipping everything from Earth, but on generating value on the moon itself with locally sourced materials and locally produced goods and services. And that model requires something that no amount of launch cost reduction can directly provide. If the price of reaching the moon dropped to something comparable to an international airline ticket, if the transportation barrier were for practical purposes eliminated, would that be sufficient to generate a self-sustaining lunar economy? Or is there something that money alone cannot purchase, no matter how affordable the journey becomes? The answer lies in something that appears in no engineering blueprint, no mission architecture document, no launch cost projection. And it is the same thing that has destroyed every ambitious human settlement attempt throughout recorded history. Human beings have a complicated relationship with the idea of settling in places that do not want to be settled. Throughout history, in moments of ambition or desperation, or strategic necessity, our species has looked at environments that were objectively hostile to comfortable human life and decided to build there anyway. Sometimes the reasons were economic, sometimes military, sometimes ideological, and in a surprisingly consistent pattern across vastly different cultures, time periods, and technological contexts, these settlements have followed the same arc construction, population apparent success, and then, when the specific reason that too justified the settlement's existence weakened or disappeared, rapid, total abandonment. The pattern is so consistent that it begins to look less like a series of individual failures and more like a law. Consider Hashima Island off the coast of Nagasaki Prefecture in Japan. If you were designing a thought experiment to test whether human ingenuity could sustain a settlement in a fundamentally inhospitable environment, Hashima would be your model. The island is tiny, barely 16 acres of usable surface. It has no natural resources beyond the coal seam discovered beneath its surrounding seabed in the late 19th century. It has no agricultural land, no fresh water supply, no natural shelter from typhoons. By any ordinary assessment, it is an absurd place to build a city. And yet, at its peak in the early 1960s, Hiroshima housed approximately 5,000 people in one of the densest urban environments ever recorded anywhere on Earth. Apartment blocks rose 9 and 10 stories, remarkable for the era and the location. The island had schools, a hospital, a community centre, shops, a cinema, a rooftop garden, and all the social infrastructure of a functioning, if compressed, human community. Engineers and architects had solved with considerable creativity the problem of making an uninhabitable rock into a place where thousands of people could live and work. In 1974, Nippon Steel closed the coal mine. The economic rationale for Hiroshima's existence, the specific singular reason that justified the extraordinary effort of sustaining a city on a barren rock, ceased to exist. Within 3 months, every one of those 5,000 residents had left. The schools closed, the hospital closed, the apartments were abandoned, mid-occupancy personal belongings still in place, as though the population had simply evaporated. Today, Hiroshima is a ruin, a preserved ghost city that tourists visit precisely because it illustrates with uncomfortable clarity what happens to a settlement when its economic logic disappears. The lesson is not that Hiroshima was poorly engineered. It was extraordinarily well engineered. The lesson is that engineering excellence is entirely separable from economic viability, and that a settlement which depends for its existence on a single external rationale is never truly self-sustaining, regardless of the presented sophistication of its infrastructure. Now consider the second case study, drawn from a very different context but pointing toward the same conclusion. The United States and its allies maintain a network of military installations in the Arctic and subarctic regions, research stations, early warning facilities, logistics bases, and monitoring outposts scattered across some of the most punishing environments on Earth. These facilities are built to the highest available technical standards. They are funded by defense budgets that do not need to justify themselves to quarterly earnings reports. The personnel who staff them are selected, trained, and supported with resources that civilian settlements could never access. And yet across decades of operation, a consistent pattern holds. Not one person who has been posted to these installations has chosen to remain there permanently after their assignment ended. Not one. The rotation cycles exist precisely because everyone without exception intends to leave when their tour concludes. The bases function. The personnel perform their duties competently and often with genuine dedication, but the possibility of permanent, voluntary, self-motivated settlement, the kind where people arrive, put down roots, raise families, and build lives they would choose over any alternative, has simply never materialized. Why? The answer, when you examine both of these cases and the broader historical record of extreme environment settlements, is not complicated. It is in fact elegant in its simplicity. Every human settlement that has achieved genuine long-term durability in recorded history shares one essential characteristic. The reasons for staying were stronger than the reasons for leaving, not marginally stronger. Substantially, viscerally, personally stronger, strong enough that individuals made the active choice to remain, even when departure was possible, because leaving represented a genuine sacrifice rather than an obvious relief. On the Moon, that equation runs in exactly the opposite direction. Everything about the lunar environment, the radiation, the dust, the gravity deficit, the biological costs, the isolation, the complete absence of the sensory and social richness that human beings have evolved over millions of years to require, pushes the calculation toward departure. And everything about Earth, the gravitational field, your body was built for the atmosphere. Your lungs were designed to breathe the biological and cultural ecosystem in which human identity is rooted, pulls the calculation toward return. A lunar base built and operated under current or near-future conditions would be, in the most functionally precise sense, Hiroshima in space. Its engineering might be brilliant. Its personnel might be genuinely motivated. Its mission might be scientifically valuable. But the moment the specific external rationale sustaining it, a government program, a research mandate, a geopolitical objective, weakened or ended, the departure would begin. And it would be rapid because no one would be leaving anything behind that they had chosen freely over the alternative. This is the pattern that the history of extreme environment settlements reveals clearly and without exception. And it is the pattern that current lunar architecture planning, with its focus on technical specifications and launch windows and habitat pressure ratings, almost entirely fails to address. What then would be sufficient to keep a person on the moon permanently, not because they were assigned there, not because a contract required it, but because they genuinely chose to stay, knowing that return to Earth was possible at any time? What would have to be true about the moon or about their life on it for leaving to feel like the greater loss? That question points towards something that engineers do not draw into blueprints and mission planners do not include in risk matrices, but which has determined the survival or death of every civilization in human history. There is a document sitting at the foundation of everything humanity has ever attempted in space, and it contains a paradox so perfectly constructed that 60 years of legal scholarship have not resolved it. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is the closest thing the human species has to a constitution for activity beyond Earth. It was negotiated during the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were both acutely aware that the absence of agreed rules for space behavior could generate the same kind of catastrophic miscalculation that nuclear weapons had made possible on Earth. The treaty was designed above all to prevent space from becoming another arena of territorial competition, another surface on which flags could be planted in the name of sovereign ownership. It succeeded at that specific objective with admirable clarity. Article 2 of the treaty states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. No nation can own the moon. No government can annex a lunar crater and declare it sovereign territory. This principle has held for nearly 6 decades without serious legal challenge, and it represents one of the genuinely durable achievements of Cold War-era international diplomacy. But the treaty's authors focused on preventing territorial sovereignty claims did not resolve, and arguably did not seriously consider the question of resource extraction. The treaty prohibits owning the moon. It says nothing coherent about whether you can mine it. This is not a minor semantic gap. It is a legal chasm wide enough to drive an entire industrial civilization through. The analogy that legal scholars most frequently reach for is the international law of the sea. Under established maritime law, no nation owns the open ocean. The high seas are the common heritage of mankind, a shared domain beyond national jurisdiction. And yet within that shared domain, any nation or private entity with the vessels and equipment to do so can extract fish harvest minerals from the seabed under certain regulatory frameworks and conduct commercial operations at enormous scale. The absence of ownership does not mean the absence of exploitation. It means that exploitation proceeds in a legal environment that is at best ambiguous and at worst governed entirely by the power and persistence of whoever shows up first with the largest capability. On the moon, the resource in question is not fish. It is water ice concentrated in permanently shadowed craters near the lunar South Pole regions where sunlight has never reached, and temperatures hover around -250 degrees Celsius. This ice, if confirmed in commercially extractable quantities, is arguably the most strategically significant resource in the inner solar system. Water can sustain human life directly. It can be split into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket propellant. A lunar operation capable of reliably producing propellant from local water ice would function as a refueling depot for the entire cislunar economy, dramatically reducing the cost and increasing the feasibility of missions to Mars, to the FIR asteroid belt, to anywhere that requires transit through the gravitational neighborhood of Earth and the Moon. Whoever controls access to the water ice at the lunar South Pole does not merely control a piece of real estate. They control the fuel economy of deep space exploration for generations. Now construct the conflict scenario with its full specificity. The lunar South Pole contains a limited number of craters, with the combination of characteristics required for practical water ice extraction, permanently shadowed, accessible terrain, proximity to ridgelines that receive near-continuous solar power for the equipment that would do the extracting. The number of genuinely prime locations is not unlimited. It may be quite small, and both the United States and China have identified the same general region as the target for their respective lunar South Pole programs. If American and Chinese operations were to converge on the same crater, the same specific deposit of water ice, the same patch of permanently shadowed terrain. What happens? Which legal authority resolves the dispute? The answer at present is that no court on Earth or anywhere else has jurisdiction over a territorial or resource dispute on the lunar surface. The International Court of Justice adjudicates disputes between nations that have consented to its jurisdiction over specific matters. No such consent covers lunar resource conflicts. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is a discussion forum, not a tribunal. It has no enforcement mechanism, no power to compel compliance, no authority to impose a resolution that either party is obligated to accept. The Artemis Accords, which the United States has assembled as a framework for cooperative lunar activity, represent the most serious recent attempt to fill this legal vacuum. More than 40 nations have signed them. The Accords establish principles for transparency, interoperability, coordination of activities, and the protection of heritage sites. They include provisions for safety zones around operational facilities, areas within which other operators would be expected not to interfere. But the Artemis Accords are not a treaty in the legal sense. They are a set of bilateral agreements between the United States and individual partner nations. They have no binding force on non-signatories. China has not signed them. Russia has not signed them. The Accords are in the most precise available description, a constitution without a government, a set of principles that the signatories have agreed to follow voluntarily, with no enforcement mechanism if they choose not to and no authority whatsoever over the nations that never agreed to them in the first place. The current situation in practical terms is this: territorial and resource disputes on the Moon would be resolved by the same mechanism that resolves disputes in environments beyond effective legal jurisdiction everywhere, which is to say by power, precedent, and the willingness of each party to tolerate the other's presence. Two operations that both claim the same resource deposit would handle their disagreement the way two passengers on a crowded flight handle the same unclaimed overhead bin space, by each placing their bag as decisively as possible and proceeding as though the other person's bag were not there, until the situation either resolves itself through one party's capitulation or escalates into a confrontation that nobody particularly wanted. The consequences of this legal vacuum for the economics of lunar settlement are not abstract. They are direct and disabling. Private investors, the kind whose capital would be required to fund the construction of anything resembling a lunar city, do not invest at scale in environments without clear enforceable property rights. This is not a preference or a cultural bias. It is the foundational logic of how capital allocation works. An investor who cannot legally protect the asset they have built, the resource they have extracted, or the location they have developed, has no rational basis for committing the billions or trillions required to build genuine lunar infrastructure. Without enforceable property rights, there is no private investment. Without private investment, there is no self-sustaining economy. Without a self-sustaining economy, there is no city. The chain of causation is not complicated, and no amount of engineering innovation breaks it. If a private company were to land on the lunar surface, establish operations in a resource-rich crater, and begin charging other operators for access to the location, collecting, in effect, lunar rent, would that be legal? And who precisely has the standing to say no? That legal question pulls behind it one that cuts even deeper, because a city without someone to govern it is not a city at all. It is something far more dangerous. Here is a historical claim that sounds provocative, but withstands examination in the entire recorded history of human settlement. There has never been a city that existed before its governing institutions did. Not one. The relationship between urban settlement and institutional authority is not incidental, it is definitional. Cities do not produce governments as a secondary development, the way a neighborhood might eventually form a residents' association. Cities are governed spaces. The governance is not an addition to the settlement, it is a precondition of it. The moment a sufficient number of human beings share a bounded space, with shared infrastructure and shared risks, the question of authority, who decides who, enforces, who arbitrates, does not wait politely for someone to convene a constitutional convention. It answers itself one way or another immediately. Consider the settlements that seem on first examination to be counterexamples. The favelas that spread across the hillsides of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and other Brazilian cities did not emerge from government planning. No municipal authority designed them, zoned them, or extended formal legal recognition to them for decades. By any standard definition, they were ungoverned spaces. And yet within weeks of a new favela community taking shape, identifiable power structures emerged. Organically, individuals or groups who controlled access, resolved disputes, taxed commerce, and enforced norms with whatever means were available. The governance was informal, frequently brutal, and entirely outside any official legal framework. But it was governance because the alternative, genuine anarchy in a space where people shared walls, water sources, and existential risks was not sustainable even for days. The same pattern appeared in the tenement districts of 19th century Chicago, where waves of immigrants settled in conditions of extraordinary density and legal marginalization. Within those communities, ethnic associations, block-level organizations, and informal enforcement networks emerged almost immediately, filling the authority vacuum that official city government either could not or would not fill. Human beings as a species are constitutionally incapable of occupying shared space for extended periods without generating hierarchy rules and enforcement mechanisms. The specific form varies enormously. The underlying necessity does not. Now, transport this understanding to the moon and consider what it actually means in the specific environmental context we have been building throughout this piece. A lunar settlement of any meaningful scale, let us say 1,000 people enough to constitute a functioning community rather than a research crew, faces a category of shared risk that has no precise analogue in any earthly settlement. Context. On Earth, the background environment is survivable. If your city's power grid fails, most residents survive the night through their own resources: blankets, body heat, food stored in their homes, the ambient temperature of an atmosphere that even in winter is not instantly lethal. The infrastructure of a terrestrial city is layered over an environment that, while sometimes hostile, is fundamentally compatible with human biology. On the moon, there is no background survivability. The environment outside the habitat is lethal within minutes. Every system that keeps residents alive, air recycling, water reclamation, pressure maintenance, thermal regulation, radiation shielding, is a single point of catastrophic failure if it malfunctions without adequate response. The margin between operational normalcy and mass casualty event is measured not in days or hours, but in minutes. In this environment, consider a specific scenario: the atmospheric recycling system that scrubs carbon dioxide from the settlement's air supply experiences a cascading mechanical failure. The engineering team calculates that partial repairs can be completed within 6 hours, but during that window, the system can support only 80% of the settlement's population at safe oxygen levels. The remaining 20%, 200 people, must either be evacuated to a secondary habitat with its own air supply, placed in some form of induced metabolic reduction, or if neither option is available in time, allowed to experience oxygen deprivation that will become fatal within hours. Who makes that decision? By what authority? According to what criteria? Who decides which 200 people are moved, and how that selection is made, and what happens to the person who gives the order and the people who carry it out? This is not a hypothetical designed to generate dramatic tension. This is the operational reality of a closed-loop life support environment, and versions of this scenario, smaller in scale, resolved before the fatal threshold was reached, but structurally identical, have occurred on every long-duration space mission in history. On the International Space Station, the chain of command for emergency decisions is unambiguous, extensively documented, rehearsed repeatedly before any crew member launches, and backed by the authority of national space agencies and mission control teams on the ground. Nobody on the station needs to improvise a governance structure in the middle of a crisis. A lunar city of 1,000 people, particularly one that has begun to develop independent identity, and whose residents include people who have never lived on Earth and do not feel bound by the authority of any terrestrial government, has no such pre-established clarity unless it was deliberately built before the first resident arrived. This is the liberty paradox that certain strands of space settlement advocacy have consistently failed to reckon with honestly. The vision of a lunar city as a place to escape the overreach of Earth's governments, a frontier society operating outside, established authority, free to invent new social contracts from scratch, collides directly with the physical, the reality of the environment. The more extreme and unforgiving the environment, the more comprehensive the authority required to manage shared survival systems must be. A frontier community on Earth's surface, in the worst case, can disperse. Individuals can survive independently. The failure of collective governance, while costly, is not automatically fatal to every member of the community simultaneously. On the Moon, the failure of governance in a crisis is a potential extinction event for the entire settlement. The authority required to prevent that outcome is not optional, not minimal, and not compatible with any political philosophy that treats government as an inherently suspicious imposition on individual freedom. On the Moon, government is not a philosophical preference. It is oxygen. If you were among the first 1,000 people to inhabit a lunar settlement, and the community faced the immediate necessity of designating someone with the authority to issue binding orders during a life-threatening emergency, what system would you choose? And why is the answer to that question not merely political theory, but a matter of survival? But suppose every one of those problems were resolved. Suppose physics, biology, economics, and law all yielded somehow to sufficient ingenuity and will. There would still remain one final question that nobody has been willing to ask directly. The Moon does not need to become a city to change our civilization. That sentence deserves to sit alone for a moment, because it cuts directly against the narrative that has dominated public space discourse for the better part of 6 decades. We have been measuring the success of lunar ambition by a single benchmark: permanent human settlement, to a city on another world. The species finally breaking the gravitational bond that has confined it to one planet for 300,000 years. And by that benchmark, we have been failing, spectacularly expensively, repeatedly failing. But what if the benchmark itself is wrong? What if the most valuable thing the Moon can be, not eventually not, after some distant civilizational transformation, but in the decades immediately available to us, is not a city at all? What if it only needs to become the finest laboratory our species has ever had the audacity to build? This is not a consolation prize dressed up in optimistic language. It is a genuine reorientation of what the Moon actually offers and what humanity actually needs from it in the specific window of time and capability we are operating within. The permanently shadowed craters, the radio-silent far side, the vacuum-preserved surface chemistry, none of these require a population of 10,000 residents to be scientifically exploited. They require patience, precision instruments, rotating crews of dedicated researchers, and a long-term institutional commitment of the kind that the Antarctic Research Network has demonstrated is achievable without anything resembling a city. Start with what sits inside those permanently shadowed craters at the lunar South Pole, because this is where the scientific argument becomes almost impossibly compelling. The permanently shadowed regions of the lunar South Pole have not seen direct sunlight in billions of years. This is not a figure of speech or an approximation. The geometry of certain crater floors near the pole places them in a configuration where the sun's rays, even at the extreme angles of the polar lunar sky, have never directly illuminated the surface. No photon of solar light has struck those crater floors since the craters themselves were formed by ancient impacts. And because the Moon has no atmosphere, no geological activity, no wind, no liquid water, and no biological processes of any kind, the material that settled onto those surfaces carried there by comet, impacts, meteorite bombardment, and the slow migration of volatiles across the lunar surface over cosmic timescales has remained essentially undisturbed. What is preserved in those craters is water ice and organic compounds that were deposited somewhere between 2 billion and 3 billion years ago. Not samples of that era, not fragments. A continuous chemically intact archive of material from the early solar system, sealed under conditions of near-perfect preservation, waiting to be read by instruments that we now have the capability to build and deploy. The scientific questions that material can answer are not peripheral. They sit at the center of the most important unsolved problems in planetary science. How was water distributed through the inner solar system during the period when Earth's oceans were accumulating? What was the chemical composition of the comets and asteroids that delivered organic molecules to the early Earth? Molecules that, under conditions still incompletely understood, eventually gave rise to the first living organisms. What does the isotopic record preserved in those crater floors tell us about the radiation environment of the early solar system? The variability of the young sun and the dynamics of material transport between the outer and inner solar system during the epoch. When the habitability of rocky planets was being determined, no other location we can reach within the next several decades preserves this record with comparable fidelity. A research station positioned to conduct systematic long-duration sampling and analysis of those deposits would not be conducting incremental science at the margins of existing knowledge. It would be reading primary source documents from an era that the geological record of Earth has almost entirely erased. Now turn to the far side of the Moon, which offers a completely orthogonal category of scientific value, one that has nothing to do with chemistry or geology, and everything to do with silence. The electromagnetic environment near Earth is catastrophically noisy from an astronomical perspective. Every human technology that generates or transmits electrical power radiates across the radio spectrum. The cumulative electromagnetic output of a civilization operating 7 billion electronic devices, millions of cellular towers, thousands of radar installations, and hundreds of operational satellites creates a noise floor that radio astronomers must work around, compensate for, and ultimately accept as an inescapable constraint on what their instruments can detect. Remote mountain valleys, protected frequency zones, international radio quiet agreements, all of these help at the margins. None of them eliminate the fundamental problem, which is that the radio sky, as seen from Earth, is contaminated by the civilizations sitting beneath every telescope. The far side of the Moon is the only location within practical reach that eliminates this problem entirely and permanently. The Moon's own solid bulk, a body approximately 3,500 kilometers across, sits between any instrument on its far side and every source of terrestrial radio interference, blocking every frequency at all times without exception. A radio telescope array deployed on the lunar far side would operate in an electromagnetic environment that has not existed anywhere near Earth since the moment our ancestors first generated electricity with intention. At the lowest radio frequencies, the wavelengths that Earth's ionosphere reflects away entirely, that no ground-based instrument has ever detected, and that carry the imprint of the universe's earliest observable epoch, a lunar. A far-side telescope array would open a window that is in the most literal sense inaccessible from anywhere else. The signal astronomers are searching for at these frequencies is the faint imprint of the cosmic dark ages, the 200 million year interval between the universe becoming transparent to light and the ignition of the first stars, during which the cosmos consisted entirely of cooling hydrogen gas, waiting for gravity to collapse it into the first structures. Detecting that signal would mean observing the universe before a single star had ever burned, before a single planet had ever formed, before any of the conditions that eventually led to the existence of a species curious enough to build a telescope and point it at the beginning of time. No city is required to build that telescope. A research outpost, a permanent robotic installation, supported by occasional human maintenance crews, and a sustained funding commitment are sufficient. The limiting factor has never been the absence of a city. It has been the absence of the will to treat the Moon as a scientific platform rather than a settlement project. The comparison that makes this argument most concrete is the network of Antarctic research stations that has operated since the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. Nobody lives permanently in Antarctica. Nobody raises children at McMurdo Station or Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. The populations of these facilities consist entirely of rotating researchers and support personnel who measure their stays in months and return home at the end of their assignments. The infrastructure that sustains them depends completely on regular resupply from outside. By every metric we have been applying to lunar settlement ambitions throughout this story, Antarctic research stations are failures as cities. As scientific platforms, they have been transformative at a civilizational scale. The ice core record extracted from the Antarctic ice sheet has given climate science a direct observational baseline, extending approximately 800,000 years into the past. A data set that is foundational to every serious model of how Earth's climate system responds to changes in atmospheric composition. Measurements of the stratospheric ozone layer conducted from Antarctic stations in the 1980s, produced the empirical evidence that drove the negotiation of the Montreal Protocol, the treaty that reversed the destruction of the ozone layer and represents arguably the most successful international environmental agreement in history. The continent did not need to become a city to change the world. It needed to become a well-operated, persistently funded scientific platform. The moon can be Antarctica, multiplied by the difference in the scale of the questions it can answer. Antarctica tells us about Earth. The moon can tell us about the solar system, the early universe, the chemistry of life's origin, and the processes that made our planet habitable. The scientific return is not comparable. It is categorically larger. The moon may never have a coffee shop. It may never have a barbershop open on Saturday morning, or a school where children argue about history and learn to play instruments. But it could have a telescope that hears the echo of the Big Bang, the specific pattern that the universe's first light imprinted on space when the cosmos was less than 400,000 years old. No barbershop on Earth has ever done that. No city in human history has ever hosted an instrument with that reach. If a lunar research station, a scientific platform staffed by rotating crews, supported by robotic systems, and funded with the sustained institutional commitment that the Antarctic network has demonstrated is achievable, were to recover from those permanently shadowed craters definitive chemical, evidence of biological activity in the early solar system, proof that life had emerged and been extinguished in the inner solar system before Earth's oceans finished forming. The demonstration that the origin of life is not a singular improbable event, but a process the solar system attempted at least twice. Would that discovery by itself justify the entire accumulated cost of every space exploration program humanity has ever funded? But the deepest value of the moon does not lie only in what we might find preserved in its ancient craters or broadcast through its radio-silent sky. It lies in what we are forced to learn, to invent, and to understand about ourselves in the process of simply trying to stay alive there. There is a pattern in the history of human technological development that is so consistent across such different contexts and time periods that it amounts to something close to a law. When people operate at the absolute edge of what their current capabilities can sustain, when every system is being pushed beyond its previously tested limits, when failure is unacceptable rather than merely costly when conventional, the approaches have been tried and found inadequate. They do not merely solve the specific problem they set out to address. They generate as an unavoidable consequence of the attempt solutions to entirely different problems that they were not consciously trying to solve. The primary challenge serves as a forcing function. The difficulty of the core problem creates pressure across every adjacent domain, and that pressure produces innovations whose value extends far beyond the original context that generated them. No environment in the accessible solar system applies this forcing pressure more comprehensively or more relentlessly than the moon. And the three domains where this pressure will be most transformative, life support, energy generation, and bone medicine, share a common feature. The problems they force us to solve on the moon are problems that a large fraction of the human population on Earth already needs solved and for which adequate solutions do not currently exist. The first domain is water, and the technology is the closed-loop life support system. Every human habitat currently operating in space runs on a partially closed life support loop. The International Space Station recovers a significant portion of the water. Its crew produces urine, is processed through a multi-stage purification system into potable water cabin. Humidity is captured and recycled and regenerates. Oxygen from carbon dioxide through chemical electrolysis. These represent genuine engineering achievements that required decades of development and iteration to reach their current reliability. But the closure is incomplete. Regular resupply missions deliver consumables that the station's recycling systems cannot fully replace. Inefficiencies in the water recovery loop are managed by simply delivering fresh water alongside other cargo. The station operates on a model that tolerates imperfect closure because the logistical penalty of imperfection, the cost of a resupply mission, is manageable within the economics of low Earth orbit operations. On the moon, that tolerance evaporates completely. The cost of delivering consumables to the lunar surface is not manageable at any habitation scale that matters. If a lunar installation is to support more than a minimal rotating crew for more than a brief expedition period, without consuming resources at a rate that no public or private entity on Earth can sustain, it must achieve something, approaching 100% closure across every consumable loop. Every molecule of water that enters the system through human metabolism, food preparation, hygiene, and atmospheric moisture must be recovered, purified, and returned to circulation. Every kilogram of organic waste must be processed back into useful inputs, whether for biological food production, chemical reactions that support other systems, or direct energy recovery, rather than accumulating as a liability that must eventually be disposed of somehow. No system of this kind exists at reliable operational scale for the duration and population that serious lunar habitation requires. Developing it, designing the biological, chemical, and mechanical processes that together achieve near-perfect closure, deploying them in an environment where the people depending on them cannot simply step outside while a component is repaired, operating them across years rather than the months that current space mission durations cover, and iterating through the failures that are inevitable when complex integrated systems are pushed to their limits is one of the defining engineering challenges of the entire lunar program. The knowledge that emerges from that process does not remain on the moon. A water recycling technology capable of recovering clean drinking water from any organic input stream at efficiencies approaching 100% in a package that requires minimal maintenance and no specialist infrastructure solves a problem that approximately 2 billion people on Earth face every day. The communities most severely affected rural populations across sub-Saharan Africa, arid zones of South and Central Asia, remote indigenous settlements across the Americas and the Pacific are precisely the communities where conventional water infrastructure investment has proven most difficult to sustain, and where a compact, self-contained, high-efficiency recycling system would be most transformative. The moon forces the development of this technology because the moon offers no alternative. The people who will benefit most from it will never leave the planet. The second domain is energy, and the forcing mechanism is the length of the lunar night. The lunar rotation period is approximately 29.5 Earth days, divided between a roughly 14-day period of continuous sunlight and a roughly 14-day period of complete darkness. During the lunar night, surface temperatures in equatorial and mid-latitude regions drop to approximately negative 170 degrees Celsius. Solar panels, the most mature and cost-efficient power generation technology available for space applications, produce exactly zero electricity for those 14 days. Energy storage capable of carrying a meaningful installation through a 14-day blackout would, using current battery technology, require a mass and volume that no realistic near-future launch architecture can deliver to the braid. Lunar surface as payload. The arithmetic of electrochemical storage at lunar night scale simply does not close. The only technically credible solution is a compact nuclear fission reactor, a power system that generates electricity from nuclear fuel independently of any external energy source continuously for extended periods without refueling, significant maintenance. Not the large-scale reactors that generate commercial electricity in terrestrial power plants, which are massive, require extensive on-site engineering expertise for operation, and are designed for maintenance by specialist teams, available within hours. What the moon requires is fundamentally different: a reactor compact enough to be transported as a single payload aboard an existing or near-future launch vehicle, robust enough to survive that launch and subsequent deployment in a master gay, a remote location safe enough to operate in, proximity to a crewed facility, and reliable enough to run for 20 or more years with maintenance performed by crew members whose primary expertise is in other domains entirely. Meeting that specification will produce a nuclear power technology with direct and immediate application to some of the most energy-impoverished communities on Earth. Remote settlements in northern Alaska, the Canadian subarctic Siberia, and across the high-latitude regions of the developing world are currently powered by diesel generators whose fuel is delivered by seasonal barge or aircraft at costs that make local electricity prices several times higher than in grid-connected regions. The economic ceiling this imposes on educational, medical, and economic development in these communities is substantial and well documented. A compact fission reactor that can be installed without a large specialist workforce, operated safely for 2 decades without refueling, and maintained without access to a specialized supply chain would remove that ceiling. The Moon forces its development. The Arctic community that benefits from it will be heating its school and powering its clinic with technology that was designed to survive a 14-day lunar night. The third domain is medicine, and specifically the biology of bone. The degradation of the human skeleton in reduced gravity examined in detail when discussing the Moon's biological weapons against long-term habitation is not only an astronaut health problem, it is a compressed, accelerated version of the same process that unfolds across decades in aging human bodies everywhere on Earth. Osteoporosis affects an estimated 200 million people globally and is the underlying cause of the hip fractures, vertebral compressions, and wrist fractures that collectively represent one of the largest sources of disability, hospitalization, cost, and mortality in elderly populations across every high-income country and an increasing proportion of middle-income ones. Existing treatments, various classes of pharmaceuticals targeting the cellular mechanisms of bone remodeling, hormone therapies, nutritional interventions are partially effective and associated with side effects and contraindications that limit their application. The molecular and cellular mechanisms by which reduced mechanical loading signals changes in the balance between bone formation and bone resorption are understood in outline, but not in the detail required to design highly targeted therapeutic interventions. The lunar environment applies research pressure to this problem at an intensity that no terrestrial medical research program matches. On Earth, meaningful bone loss from osteoporosis develops over years and decades. Clinical trials require extended follow-up periods to detect statistically significant differences between treatment groups. On the Moon, significant bone loss occurs within months. The feedback cycle between intervention and measurable outcome is rapid. The consequence of inadequate treatment is not a future health risk, but an immediate operational constraint. The Moon does not permit bone health to be a background concern managed by periodic monitoring and long-term clinical follow-up. It makes bone health an immediate operational imperative, with a timeline measured in mission months rather than patient decades. The mechanistic understanding of bone remodeling pathways that must be developed to design effective interventions for this compressed timeline will translate directly into improved treatments for osteoporosis in aging populations on Earth. The patients who benefit will have lived their entire lives at one gravitational unit, will never approach a spacecraft, and will receive treatment for a condition that was better understood and therefore better treated, because a small group of researchers once needed to keep their skeletons intact on a crater rim 239,000 miles from the nearest orthopedic surgeon. Apollo demonstrated this pattern once clearly enough that it should have become a principle rather than a historical footnote. The program did not produce a city. What it produced as an unavoidable byproduct of operating at the absolute boundary of 1960s engineering capability was a generation of material science advances, miniaturization techniques, water filtration methods, and thermal management solutions that found their way into applications ranging from the foam in athletic shoes to the image processing algorithms underlying modern medical imaging. Apollo asked the Moon to let it land. The Moon answered by forcing the invention of tools that changed daily life on Earth. The questions Apollo did not consciously ask were answered anyway, because the primary challenge was hard enough to make answering them unavoidable. Space does not give you what you asked for. It gives you what you needed, revealed by the difficulty of the asking. If the complete financial cost of the Artemis program, every dollar directed toward rockets, habitat systems, spacesuits, training infrastructure, mission control operations, and all supporting development across its full operational lifetime, were ultimately recovered through the commercial and social, the value of the technologies it forced into existence, technologies that now deliver clean water to communities that currently lack it, clean power to settlements that currently cannot afford it, and effective bone disease treatment to populations that will otherwise be disabled by it. Would that constitute adequate justification for the program? Or does space exploration require a different framework of evaluation entirely, one that cannot be reduced to the logic of return on investment? But there is one thing the Moon will teach us that no technology transfer can capture, that no patent portfolio can contain, and that no accounting framework can adequately represent. It will not come from a successful experiment or a celebrated discovery. It will come from a very specific kind of failure, and what it reveals about the civilization that sent people there is more important than any invention those people might bring back. No government in history has ever built a city because it decided a city should exist. This is not a cynical statement. It is not a critique of public institutions or a celebration of private enterprise. It is simply an observation about how cities have actually come into being across the entire recorded span of human civilization. Governments build roads, governments maintain armies, governments collect taxes and operate courts and construct the administrative machinery through which collective decisions are enforced. But cities, the dense, economically complex, self-reproducing communities that have served as the engine of human cultural and material progress for the past 10,000 years, have consistently emerged not from deliberate governmental construction, but from the accumulation of independent decisions made by thousands of individuals who each concluded for their own reasons that a particular location offered something worth showing up for. The port of Houston did not appear because a committee in Washington determined that the Gulf Coast required a major shipping hub. The city grew because the geography of Galveston Bay combined with the discovery of oil at Spindletop in 1901 to create an economic logic so compelling that capital, labour and ambition flowed toward it from across the Fav, continent with a momentum that no single institution directed or could have directed. New Orleans exists where it does at the mouth of the Mississippi River, in a location so prone to flooding that every generation of its residents has had legitimate reason to question the wisdom of remaining, because the river's geography made it the unavoidable terminus of the entire interior, continental trade network. The city did not choose its location because the location was comfortable. The location chose the city because the location was economically indispensable. This pattern repeats without exception. Singapore sits at the narrowest point of the Strait of Malacca, the maritime choke point through which the majority of global shipping between the Pacific and Indian Oceans must pass, and became one of the wealthiest cities on Earth, not because any government planned a great city there, but because the ship that wanted to get from one ocean to the other had to pass nearby, and passing nearby creates commerce, and commerce creates infrastructure. And infrastructure creates the conditions under which a city becomes not just possible but inevitable. The question of whether a city can exist on the moon, then, is not fundamentally a question about rockets or habitats or radiation shielding or any of the extraordinary engineering challenges we have spent the previous sections examining in detail. It is a question about whether the moon can ever generate the same kind of inescapable economic logic that the mouth of the Mississippi or the Strait of Malacca generated on Earth. Whether there is something about the moon's position, something about what it offers or what must pass through it or what can only be extracted from it that would make a sufficient number of economically rational actors conclude that being there is worth the extraordinary cost and difficulty of Tao's being there. And when you examine the moon through that lens, rather than the lens of national prestige or scientific ambition, or the romantic pull of humanity's destiny among the stars, one candidate for that economic logic becomes visible above all others. It is not glamorous. It does not appear in the kind of promotional materials that space agencies produce to generate public enthusiasm. The path to a lunar city runs directly through a gas station, specifically through a very cold gas station located at the bottom of a permanently shadowed crater near the lunar South Pole, operating at temperatures of approximately negative 250 degrees Celsius, extracting water ice from regolith that has not been disturbed since before the dinosaurs appeared on Earth, splitting that water into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, powered by a compact nuclear reactor, compressing the resulting gases into propellant tanks, and selling that propellant to spacecraft on their way to destinations that would be economically unreachable without a refueling stop. This is what cislunar economists mean when they describe the moon as a potential propellant depot for deep space operations. The concept is straightforward once you understand the underlying physics. Getting anything from Earth's surface to the surface of Mars requires escaping Earth's gravitational field, crossing interplanetary space, and then decelerating into Mars orbit and descending to the Martian surface. The propellant required for each of those maneuvers is enormous, and propellant launched from Earth's surface must itself be lifted out of Earth's deep gravitational well, which requires more propellant, which must also be lifted in. A compounding relationship that mission planners call the tyranny of the rocket equation. If instead a spacecraft could launch from Earth carrying only enough propellant to reach lunar orbit, refuel there using propellant manufactured from lunar water ice, and then depart for Mars with full tanks to the total mass that must be launched from Earth's surface, would be dramatically reduced. Estimates vary depending on mission architecture, but the potential reduction in Earth launch mass for a crewed Mars mission ranges from 30 to 60% depending on how the numbers are calculated. At any price point for Earth to orbit launch, that reduction is economically transformative. A lunar propellant depot positioned in cislunar space would function in the economics of deep space travel exactly as Singapore functions in maritime trade. It would be the unavoidable stop. The place every ship heading further out would need to visit, not because anyone required it to, but because the alternative carrying everything from Earth would be financially prohibitive at the scales required for serious interplanetary operations. And a location that every outbound spacecraft must visit is a location where commerce accumulates, where supporting infrastructure develops, where secondary services cluster, where the human presence that initially existed only to operate the propellant extraction equipment gradually expands to service the traffic that the depot itself has generated. That is how a city happens, not through decision but through accumulation. The prerequisite chain is long, however, and none of its links can be skipped. First, the water ice deposits at the lunar South Pole must be confirmed in commercially extractable quantities. Current evidence from orbital spectroscopy and the deliberately impacted L-Cross probe suggests substantial concentrations exist in the permanently shadowed craters, but orbital measurements cannot substitute for direct surface sampling at the scale and distribution required to assess commercial viability. The confirmation requires surface access robots, initially then humans, to interpret ambiguous data and direct adaptive sampling strategies. Second, the extraction technology must be developed systems capable of mining regolith at cryogenic temperatures, processing it to release the water ice, and operating for years without maintenance by specialist engineers who are not present on site. Third, the electrolysis and liquefaction infrastructure must be built, tested, and proven, reliable enough that a spacecraft captain in Mars-bound transit would bet their mission on the propellant it produces. Fourth, and this is the step that the engineering focus of most lunar planning discussions glosses over, a market must exist. Spacecraft operators who would purchase lunar propellant rather than launching their own from Earth must exist in sufficient number and with sufficient frequency that the depot's operating costs can be covered and its investors can recover their capital. None of that market exists yet because none of the spacecraft capable of using it exist yet, because none of the missions those spacecraft would fly have been funded, because none of the economic case for those missions has been demonstrated, because none of the propellant they would need is available. The entire system is a loop in which every element depends on every other element, and no element currently exists at commercial scale. Threading that loop will take decades of patient, unglamorous, iterative research conducted from the kind of rotating crew research stations that the previous section described, facilities whose primary purpose is scientific but whose secondary purpose is laying the groundwork for the economic transformation that science makes possible. The romantic version of lunar settlement imagines a city rising from the dust in a single generation of national will and heroic engineering. The realistic version looks considerably less cinematic. It involves in rough sequence robotic confirmation of South Polar ice reserves, spanning perhaps a decade, followed by crewed research stations conducting detailed geological and chemical characterization of those reserves across another decade or two, followed by the first small-scale extraction, demonstrations to prove the technology works at lunar surface conditions across yet another decade, followed by the gradual development of commercial propellant production at scales small enough to be funded by early adopter customers, willing to pay a premium for the novelty, followed by the slow accumulation of that customer base as interplanetary mission, economic shift in the depot's favor, followed by the expansion of the depot operation to meet growing demand, followed by the emergence of secondary services, clustering around the traffic the depot has generated, followed finally by something that begins to look like a permanent human community, not planned, not constructed in a single ambitious push, but accumulated through the aggregate of thousands of individual economic decisions that each made sense at the time. That process, from first robotic scouting mission to something recognizable as an urban community, probably requires 50 to 70 years under optimistic assumptions. It is not the story that fills auditoriums at aerospace conferences or inspires the speeches that politicians give when they want to associate themselves with humanity's destiny. It is considerably more honest than those stories and considerably more likely to arrive at its destination. The path to a lunar city runs through a propellant depot. The path to a propellant depot runs through decades of unglamorous research. The path to unglamorous research runs through the political will to fund institutions that return value on timescales longer than any individual career or electoral cycle. This is not the narrative arc that the science fiction tradition prepared us to expect, but it is how economics actually operates, not in dramatic leaps, but in the slow, accumulating logic of infrastructure that makes the next step slightly less impossible than the last one. If a private company announced tomorrow that it could be operating a profitable lunar propellant production facility within 20 years, profitable in the sense that revenue from propellant sales covers operating costs and generates return on the capital invested in development, would you believe it? And more precisely, what specific evidence, what particular combination of demonstrated technology and confirmed market demand and verified ice deposits would move you from skepticism to reasonable confidence? The answer to that question depends on a discovery we are still waiting for, one that could change the entire calculus within the next few years. There is a map that exists nowhere on paper, no cartographer has drawn it, no mission planning document has reproduced it, but it is the only map that matters if you want to understand where we actually are in the story of humanity's relationship with the moon. It does not show distances in kilometers or travel times in days. It shows distances in civilizational readiness. The gap between what we are capable of doing right now today with the technology and institutions and collective will that currently exist, and what would need to be true about our civilization, for the city we have spent this entire story examining to become not just theoretically possible, but genuinely inevitable. That gap is not measured in rocket thrust or habitat volume or propellant production capacity. It is measured in the quality of our thinking, the honesty of our planning, and the depth of our willingness to commit to projects whose payoff will be collected by people not yet born. Homo sapiens has existed as a recognizable species for approximately 300,000 years. For all 300,000 of those years, without exception, every human being who ever lived drew their first breath on Earth and returned the material of their body to Earth when their life ended. Every child born in those 300 millennia entered a gravitational field of 1 unit, breathed an atmosphere, assembled by billions of years of biological and geological process, drank water that had cycled through clouds and rivers, and ice caps across geological time. The planet did not merely house our species, it built our species atom by atom and generation by generation in the specific medium of its own physical conditions. For the first time in those 300,000 years, we are holding in our hands the tools to change that. Not the will necessarily, not the wisdom demonstrably, but the tools. The rockets exist. The orbital mechanics are understood. The basic life support principles are demonstrated. The destination is mapped with a resolution that would have seemed supernatural to every generation of humans who looked up at the moon from campfires and wondered what it was. And we are with almost impressive consistency asking the wrong question about what to do with those tools. The question we keep asking is, when will there be a city on the moon? The question is embedded in every 10-year roadmap, every presidential directive, every conference panel, and documentary and popular science article about the future of human space exploration. It is asked with the implicit assumption that a city on the moon is the destination, the endpoint whose arrival will signal that the project has succeeded, that the species has graduated to a new level of civilizational capacity, that the 300,000-year chapter of Earth-only existence is definitively closed. But a city is not a destination. A city is a consequence. It is what happens when the conditions for a city exist, when the economics are right, when the governance is functional, when the biology is understood, when the legal framework can support long-term investment, when enough people have enough reasons to stay, that leaving begins to feel like the greater sacrifice. No city in human history was ever achieved by deciding to build a city. Every city in human history arrived as the outcome of a long sequence of prior conditions being met, usually without anyone fully recognizing in the moment that what they were doing would eventually produce a city. The right question, the question that if asked seriously and answered honestly, would actually advance the project, is different. It is not when will there be a city on the moon. It is what kind of civilization does humanity need to become for that to be possible. That reframing is not a semantic adjustment. It is a complete inversion of priorities. Asking when places the agency outside the present moment. The city is something that will happen in the future, something that our current choices are building toward, but whose arrival belongs to another generation. Asking what kind of civilization places the agency squarely in the present. The obstacle is not technological or financial or even scientific, but civilizational, and civilization is something we are actively constructing or failing to construct right now in the choices we make about how we govern, scientific funding, how we structure international cooperation, how we think about obligations to generations we will never meet. The civilizational distance between where we stand and where a self-sustaining lunar city requires us to be is not primarily a distance in technical capability. It is a distance in temporal imagination. The institutions that successfully sustain long-term civilizational projects, the Gothic cathedrals that took 2 centuries to build the river management systems that sustained agricultural civilizations for millennia, the public health infrastructure that compressed childhood mortality from something every parent expected to face into something most parents in wealthy nations never encounter, were built by societies capable of making and honoring commitments that extended far beyond the lifespan of any individual who initiated them. No single person who broke ground on Chartres Cathedral ever saw its spires completed. They built anyway because their frame of reference for meaningful commitment was not 4 years or 10 years, but the life of a civilization. The dominant political and economic structures of the early 21st century are not organized around this temporal frame. The 4-year rhythm of electoral democracy, the quarterly reporting cycle of public corporations, the 18-month attention span of media discourse, all of these systematically discount the future in ways that make century-scale institutional commitment structurally difficult, not impossible, difficult. The Antarctic Research Network and the Internet's foundational infrastructure and the global positioning system all demonstrate that sustained multi-generational public investment is achievable within democratic political systems, when the commitment is organized correctly, but it requires deliberate institutional design to insulate the project from the short-term pressures that would otherwise consume it. A lunar city asks for exactly that institutional design, applied not to a single technology or research program, but to an entire civilizational trajectory. It asks us to think about obligations to people who are not yet born in a place that does not yet have residents solving problems that have not yet been precisely defined. It asks us to measure success not by whether we planted a flag by a particular date, but by whether we laid foundations that remained solid 50 years after the people who laid them were gone. That is not a challenge that belongs to engineers or scientists or mission planners, though all of them are necessary. It is a challenge that belongs to the civilization itself, to the entire collective enterprise of how human beings organize their resources, their attention, and their care across time. The moon has looked down at Earth for 4.5 billion years. It watched the first self-replicating molecules assemble themselves in ancient oceans. It watched the first organisms develop the capacity to capture sunlight and convert it to chemical energy, transforming the planet's atmosphere in the process. It watched the first creatures develop spines and crawl onto land and eventually stand upright and look back at the sky with something recognizably like wonder. It watched the first words be spoken, the first fire be lit, the first story be told about what the light in the night sky might mean. It watched from its fixed and patient distance as the thing looking up at it gradually became a civilization capable of reaching back. For the first time in 4.5 billion years, the looking is becoming mutual. Earth is looking at the moon, not passively, not reverently, but with intention. With the specific instrumental future-oriented intention of a species that is for the first time seriously considering what it would mean to extend itself beyond the only world it has ever known. That is not a small thing. It is, depending on what we do with it, either the first chapter of the most significant story in our species' history, or a prologue to a chapter we never found the civilizational depth to actually write. The first city on the moon will not be built from concrete or steel. It will be built from honesty about the distance we still have to travel. Not the distance measured in kilometers between 2 points in space. The distance measured in the gap between what we are willing to commit to today and what a project of this magnitude actually requires. The distance between the temporal imagination of a civilization that thinks in election cycles and the temporal imagination of a civilization that can think in centuries. The distance between treating the moon as a destination to visit and treating it as a place where the next chapter of human existence will genuinely unfold. That city is not built yet. The story is not finished. And the question that determines how it ends does not belong to the future. It belongs to right now. If you are the generation that decides whether humanity becomes a multiplanetary species, not by planting a flag, not by announcing a roadmap, but by actually changing the way this civilization thinks about time and commitment and for obligation to the unborn, what would you change about how we are doing this right now?